Okay, I couldn't resist recording the next chapter until tomorrow because I have to remember. I don't remember exactly what happens, and I've got to find out. So, this is chapter 4, Goodbye, Oldtimer. And you see Brighty here rolling on his back. The night was noiseless except for the wind and the river. A few sparks gleamed in the fire like fallen stars. Brighty edged closer to the dying glow. The sand felt warm and scratchy to his skin as he lay squirming on his back, his hoofs pawing at the chink of sky between the canyon walls. After a time, the moon showed itself and gradually, very gradually, began whitewashing rocks. The moonlight whitened Brighty's belly too, and his nose as he lay blinking upward. At last he snuggled into the nest he had made in the sand and let sleep claim him while the wind played with his hair. All night long, the wind and river went about their business, flowing through the canyon. Towards morning, Brighty's thirst awakened him, and he took off for Bright Angel Creek, a small gray shadow winding along the deeper shadows of the morning. There was burrow brush on his way, and he stopped to browse here and there until his thirst pulled him on to the chattering creek. He waded far upstream, up where the water flowed so clear he could see trout darting under the rocks. He drank his fill, not in one long sip, but a little here and there, up and down the creek, until he was satisfied. Sometimes he stood quite still, letting the water foam and splash around his legs, but more often he got into a rough and tumble with the water, pawing at it madly as if they were in a fight. Then he stood over it like he had won, blowing and snorting out his nose as he watched the sand settle to the bottom of the creek again. Morning passed, the whole day passed, while Brighty played in the creek and looked around. Only occasionally he clambered over the rocks and up the walls to get away from the gushing water, but always he hurried back as if it was an old friend. With the coming of twilight, however, the babble of the creek seemed idle nonsense. He felt a need for some human company. Somewhere in the shadows far below was a nice old man who would be stirring biscuits or hotcakes. A hunger and a longing came up in him, and he scattered out upon the rocks and looked down at the campsite. There, he spotted the white tent, no bigger than a deer tail. He worked himself into a bray that sounded loud and clear. Hee-haw, hee-haw. When the last echo had died, he waited listening, but there was no answer. He brayed again, louder, fuller, longer, and again he waited for the answering hello, but again there was none at all, only the echoes growing fainter and fainter until at last they were swallowed up by silence. Even with no answer, habit was strong in him. He had to get down there. For the next hour or two he wound his way around towards the creek, and at every turn he stopped and looked down at the tent. But tonight there was no smoke curling upward, no sign of life. He looked north towards the tunnel. He was close enough now to see the ladder climbing the vertical wall. It too was empty. Oldtimer was neither going up nor coming down. As Brighty reached the rift of sand along which the tent stood, his feet slowed and then stopped altogether. Muffled voices were coming from inside, and before he could sift them apart, the lion smell of Uncle Jimmy Owen filled his nostrils. "How do you like that?" the stranger said. "Consarn it all, Jim. Only once in a coon's age me and you's had a fishing spree, and what happens? Oldtimer's gone." "He's sure gone, Sheriff, and there's something mighty wrong here. Oldtimer'd never leave his camp like this. And his watch still hanging here? If he'd gone off to Flagstaff, he would have taken it along and tidied the place. It ain't like him to leave in a hurry." Uncle Jim's voice sharpened. "Something's happened to him, sure as shooting." "You mean he's killed, perhaps, right under my nose?" Brighty pushed the tent flap aside, only to face the muzzle of a gun. "Sheriff!" Uncle Jimmy's voice was a command. "Save your lead, it's only Bright Angel. You remember him." And the next thing Brighty knew, a slight figure had darted around the sheriff, and a pair of friendly hands was petting his ears. Uncle Jimmy Owen was a small-sized man, but built strong. He had sandy hair and a sandy mustache and mild grayish eyes that now looked full into Brighty's, as if he expected them to tell him something. But all he saw was his own face, mirrored in Brighty's black eyes. He placed his hand on Brighty's chest and gently backed him out of the tent. "Brighty," he said into the big furry ears, "things look bad for our Oldtimer." A wind was blowing towards them, and Brighty sucked it in. A noise grew in his throat, grew into a crescendo of braying. His face towards the tunnel as if his calling could penetrate the darkness and pulled the old prospector out of it. "There now, Brighty, there now, feller," Uncle Jimmy soothed. The sheriff's voice was full of annoyance. "Quit talking to that donkey and listen to me, Jim Owen." He pointed to the vertical wall rising behind the tent. "See that narrow scar in the rock? That might be a trail leading away from the tunnel." Uncle Jim nodded. "Well, I'm going up there to follow along and see where it goes. You stay at camp, Jim, and you better have your 6-shooter ready. There may be a killer around here." The sheriff strode off while Uncle Jim, with Brighty at his heel, walked over to the remains of the fire. He picked up 2 cups near the ashes. "Mark my words, Brighty. Oldtimer had company for breakfast. These cups still have a swallow of strong coffee in 'em." He nodded to himself as he picked up 2 sticky plates. "Now I reconstructs the story this way. Some fugitive from justice knew this here Grand Canyon is made up of hundreds of little side canyons to hide in. But by and by he gets hungry, see, and tired of living on fish. He smells camp smoke, dinner cooking, and well, you know Oldtimer Brighty. He'd share his grub with you or me or anybody. And probably he couldn't help telling about the copper vein he struck. You know how trusting he was. Then this other feller." Uncle Jim broke off as he saw the sheriff hurrying back. "It gets worse and worse, Jim," the sheriff panted, swabbing his hat brim with his handkerchief. "There's 2 sets of footprints up in the tunnel, and Oldtimer's pick and shovel lying there on the ground. Looks like someone was digging and then left in an all-fired hurry. His head went around on its neck like an owl's. Now, if I was a criminal, where'd I hide?" Uncle Jim shrugged. "The canyon's full of hidey holes. Figure it yourself, Sheriff. 200 miles of little caves." All right. And since you're so smart, if you was a sheriff and you spotted a fresh state claim and the owner missing, how do you go about solving the mystery?" Uncle Jim thought a moment. His finger moved along the stripe on Brighty's back, then on the crosspiece over his shoulder. "Well, if I was sheriff," he said at last, "I'd count on the canyon to trap my man. Ain't nothing like a canyon to squeeze a feller in. The raven birds hollering at him, the snakes sticking out their tongues, and willow trees pointing their skinny fingers, and faces in the rocks accusing him." Uncle Jim stopped short. "Speaking of rocks, Sheriff, I'd like to be sure of one thing." He led the way down to the river and began leaping from boulder to boulder, his eyes squinting. "You're looking for clothing snagged onto rocks, ain't you?" the sheriff shouted, trying to keep up. "Yeah, I already done that." "Hey, look yonder." The sheriff followed Uncle Jimmy's finger to Brighty, standing on the shore, shaking something black between his teeth. As he came toward him, the men saw that the black thing was a hat. Brighty was snaking it along, playing with it, and suddenly a blue jay's feather loosened from the hat band and fell into the sand. Uncle Jim bent down and picked up the feather. He took the hat from Brighty's mouth and carefully brushed it with his sleeve. He tried to hide his feelings, and then gave up and buried his face inside the hat and cried. "The Colorado River never gives up its dead," he whispered, too softly for anyone to hear. He stuck the feather back into the hat band and gave his own gray hat to Brighty to play with. Wordless, he tried on the black one, Oldtimer's hat. It was an almost fit. A little sweating in it on a hot day, and it would mold to fit his head. The sheriff stared into the foaming water, his eyes narrowed, and thought, "How did it happen?" he said to himself. "Oldtimer wouldn't just fall into the river, not an old canyon man like him. No, it wasn't an accident." He paused, and his eyes traveled up the cliff to the ledge of rock running towards the mouth of the mine. Suddenly he nodded. "I see it plain as day. Somebody must have pushed him into the river." Uncle Jim wiped his eyes. "Goodbye, Oldtimer." And he touched the hat brim in a salute. "And don't you worry none about Brighty." Then his face changed. A look of steel came into his eyes and his jaw clenched. "Afore we die," he said, staring at the sucking whirlpool of water, "Brighty and me, we'll find your killer and even the score." The wind picked up his words and scattered them over the river, while the men in the burro walked towards the camp. As soon as Uncle Jim entered the tent, he knew the killer was still in the canyon. Oldtimer's watch was gone.